still exists. This is the Queen Mary, built in the early 1930s and which crossed the Atlantic 1,001 times during her 31 years of passenger service. Today, the Queen Mary has been converted into a hotel and lies at permanent berth here in Southern California. She serves as a lasting monument to those great liners that sailed the oceans of the world. Now, all of them gone with this one exception. Through her, hopefully we can demonstrate what made the Titanic so truly unique. The story of the Titanic began in England shortly after the turn of the century at a dinner in this elegant London residence known as Downshire House in Belgrave Square. That evening, the decision was made to build a series of super transatlantic liners that would be larger than any other ships afloat. In terms of elegance and comfort, as well as size, they would be in a class by themselves. The first two were to be called the Olympic and Titanic. The ships would be built here at the Harland and Wolff shipyards in Belfast, Ireland, which today is still very much in operation, and where builders have been turning out ships of every size and description for more than 125 years. The location where the Olympic and Titanic were built still exists, although there is nothing to identify the history that began here. Only the rusting remains of the immense 200-foot-high gantries that once stood tall, anchored at a cement base 4.5 feet deep. By 1909, those gantries, specially erected for building these ships, towered over the yards as construction was rapidly proceeding on the first ship, the Olympic. On the left was the second of these ships, the Titanic. They were so huge, previously 3 ships would have been under construction here instead of just 2. So elaborate were the plans for the Titanic, it required a 300-page book just to list the fittings, furnishings, and decorations involved. The lengthy list of statistics is impressive. Her giant reciprocating engines were 3 stories high. Her rudder alone was over 6 stories tall and weighed 101 tons. Her 15-ton anchor required 10 horses just to pull it through the streets of Belfast. A massive workforce that eventually reached 4,000 men was assigned to the task of building the Titanic. It took them 2 years from the time her keel was laid until she was ready to leave the gantry. While these statistics are certainly impressive, it is still very hard to comprehend just how big the Titanic really was. But maybe this will help. I'm standing on the wing bridge, which is the highest deck level on this ship. From up here, the captain could view the entire 882-foot length of the Titanic. That's almost 3 football fields long. From this point down to the waterline was a distance of about 80 feet. Now, that may not sound so big, but let me tell you, from up here, that figure takes on a whole new dimension. I mean, I would hate to have to jump. And don't forget, there was still another 30 feet of ship beneath the water. By February of 1912, the RMS Titanic was nearing completion. These rare films are the only motion pictures existing of the great liner. By April 10th, the Titanic, virtually a floating palace, was ready for her maiden voyage to New York. Edith Haseman was just 15 when she boarded the Titanic with her parents. Now 91 and one of the few remaining survivors of the disaster, she still remembers the ship's beauty.
It's really a very beautiful ship. The staircase of the first class is really beautiful. And the second class is as good as the first. Just as beautifully laid the tables were, and the most beautiful paintings were up on the wall. Then they had their swimming baths and gymnasium for people and children's place. It's really it was a floating palace.
While the Titanic appeared to have everything on board one could possibly desire, there was, strangely enough, one item that was not in sufficient quantity. I am referring to the number of lifeboats. Amazingly, the designer's original proposal had called for 64. But since that was far in excess of the number required under the maritime laws of 1912, the builders cut that number back to 16 lifeboats under davits, with an additional 4 thrown in for good measure. Now, davits are the steel frames which lower the lifeboats, swing them out over the side, and enable them to be lowered. There were, by the way, many of these davits from the Titanic photographed on the ocean floor. After the disaster, it was discovered that had there been enough lifeboats on the Titanic to hold everyone, they would have needed 63, one less than the designer had originally called for.
Young as I was, I knew that there was this something in the air about it because my mother was so terribly upset at the thought of going because she had this premonition of danger, but she couldn't think what it was. And we weren't booked in the Titanic anyway. We were booked in a ship called the Philadelphia. And there was a coal strike and she didn't sail. And we were transferred to the Titanic, which everyone thought was a wonderful piece of luck. And that's when my mother's apprehension became worse. She said to my father, "I think I know now why I'm frightened." And he said, "Well, what is it?" She said, "Because this is the ship that they say is unsinkable." And he put his arm round her shoulders, and I can see this quite clearly. And he said, "No, my dear, this is the ship that is unsinkable." And she said, "Well, that is flying in the face of God, and that's why I'm frightened."
Late in the evening on April 14th, 1912, the RMS Titanic, the largest moving man-made object on this planet, struck an iceberg, and 2.5 hours later sank beneath the icy waters of the North Atlantic. Back then, the idea of locating and diving on the Titanic would have seemed absolutely ludicrous. Nevertheless, it remained an explorer's dream for the better part of this century. By the late 1970s, science and technology had finally caught up with that dream, and then it was only a matter of time until the Titanic would be found. By the early 1980s, the first serious attempts to locate the Titanic were underway. Between 1980 and 1983, Texas entrepreneur Jack Grimm sponsored 3 unsuccessful expeditions. The Titanic would lie in wait until 1985, when a joint French and American team of scientists finally solved the mystery of the ship's resting place. The mission, co-directed by Jean-Louis Michel of Ifremer and Dr. Robert Ballard of the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute, found the Titanic about 350 miles off the coast of Newfoundland. Ballard and the Woods Hole team returned to the wreck in 1986 and explored it from a deep-diving submersible. With this expedition, they were able to piece together another chapter in the Titanic story. For 74 years, there was some disagreement among Titanic survivors as to how the ship actually sank. Did it go down in one piece, or did it snap in 2, as some have maintained? Ballard and his team put that controversy to rest. At 11:40 p.m. on April 14th, the ship struck an iceberg. The Titanic then came to a full stop as water filled the ship. As the bow gradually disappeared, the stern of the ship stuck straight out of the water. The stress on the hull caused the liner to break apart between the 3rd and 4th funnels. The stern appeared to right itself, but then, as it filled with rushing water, it dipped beneath the ocean, bobbed around for more than a minute, and then it too slowly disappeared from sight. As it sank to the bottom, the contents of the stern section spilled out of the ship, landing on the ocean floor, creating a massive debris field between the severed sections of the ship. The Titanic's once grand and state-of-the-art accoutrements were now strewn across this area. Certainly one of the most startling discoveries during the expedition concerned the finding of a dramatic 30-foot in diameter hole just above the waterline in the bow section of the ship. A hole possibly caused by an internal explosion. The expedition found no long slit, no sheared rivets, and no sprung plates, which would have been caused by a collision with an iceberg. The whole offers dramatic views deep inside the Titanic in an area just above a huge coal bunker. It is known that there had been a coal bunker fire smoldering on board the Titanic from the day it left Belfast. The existence of this fire raises the possibility that an explosion occurred at the time of impact with the iceberg, possibly caused by an accumulation of combustible gases, coal dust, or a steam explosion resulting from the ice-cold water hitting the red-hot coals in the bunker. A closer examination of the area convinced the Nautile's commander, Nargeolet, a former ammunitions expert in the French Marines, that indeed the hole showed every evidence of having been caused by an explosion. This explosion theory is supported by a Seattle, Washington engineer named William Dybo, who related to us a story he had been told many times by his father.
Well, he claimed that the Titanic, in fact, never struck an iceberg. And in fact, she sank as the result of an explosion that developed from a fire in a coal bunker that had been burning from prior to when the ship sailed from Southampton. Now, he was a sergeant in the Army in World War I and heard this story firsthand from a crewman on the U.S. troop ship SS Mercury. This man claimed to have been a survivor, surviving stoker of the Titanic. And over the course of the journey back to the United States, my father spent a lot of time playing cards with this man, and this man insisted that the story of the iceberg having been struck was to conceal the real cause of the disaster. And we have always speculated that this possible cover-up was for insurance purposes.
This explosion theory remains just that, only a theory. It will be left to future expeditions to determine if indeed it has merit and could have helped contribute to the demise of the Titanic. The detached bow and stern sections are now separated by more than 3/4 of a mile of ocean terrain. The ship's agonizing plunge beneath the surface, the forces of nature and time have had a different effect on each of the two sections.
The thing I remember most about the Titanic is probably the difference between the bow section, which is classical, intact, except for the damage that has been done over the years by rust and by the sea, in comparison to the stern, where most of the people were at the end. The stern is just a big pile of junk. It's hardly recognizable. There really are very few distinguishing marks that even make it recognizable as a portion of a ship. In fact, until we went down below the stern and actually went in underneath the ship and saw one of the giant propellers, we weren't really 100% sure that we were right on the stern of the ship.
The investigations of both the bow and stern sections were extraordinary. The view of the fallen mast and crow's nest is still among the most disturbing sights. It's here that the lookout spotted the iceberg that led to the demise of the Titanic. The crow's nest bell, so clearly visible in this photograph, signaled the impending disaster. The bell was retrieved and is in remarkable condition. It is perhaps the most haunting reminder of the events of April 14th, 1912.
Nadir de Nautil pour contact immersion.
Constant communication with the sub is maintained by a complex assortment of electronic equipment able to transmit voice communication to the very bottom of the ocean. To enable the submersible's pilots to verify locations or to confer with technicians on the mother ship, the Nautile is equipped with a camera system able to transmit pictures to the surface.
Those pictures are transmitted by a hydroacoustic system, I guess.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, they are coming directly from the bottom.
Okay. And well, as far as I can know,